Sophie here with part 3 of this tutorial, the final part, in which we'll be turning the two versions of this dog painting that we've been working on into a looping animation. But before we dive in, I would like to shout out the bonus tutorial resources. There will be links in the description to both a free Gumroad listing and a public Patreon post where you can access these. There is also a paid version, which includes some extra downloads. I've talked about that enough already, so check that out if that interests you. That is available through a paid Gumroad listing and also can be accessed by becoming a patron. Alright, let's dive in. Alright, cool. So I'm ready to enter the next stage of this tutorial. So it is time to animate. So if we look at what we have, what do we get as we transition to the dark part of the animation? Unsurprisingly, we get something not great because this piece was not drawn with this background color in mind. So let's modify the piece we have to suit the background color, which we shall do with grease pencil modifiers. So the first one I'll add will be a Hue Saturation modifier. So I realized as I was planning this video that actually the result of just using this one modifier, so I lowered the value quite a bit, and then I slightly nudged the hue and saturation sliders to the left. I mean, you can see the final settings here. So I will set that up. I'll animate this. So I'll go to frame 140 where my animation ends, the light to dark transition, and I'll press on these dots next to the three values to keyframe those properties. And then back to frame 80, the start of the transition animation. Oof, that is rough. So I'll change all three values back to their original values. So that is 0.5 for the hue and then 1 for both the saturation and value sliders. The keyframes got created already because auto keying is turned on. So if we test it out now, I think that's a pretty cool animation already. But what does bother me about these darker colors is that they were not created intentionally. They're just kind of the result of using a modifier, and so I think that gives us a nice base to start from, but I would really like to spend some time adding strokes on top of this. So while I'm still in the modifiers, I'll open up the drop-down for influence, and I want this modifier to affect only the radar layer. Then back in Object Data Properties where we have our layers, I'll rename the second layer to Radar Dark. So what I can do now is I'll use the eyedropper tool in draw mode to select some colors from the dark version of this piece. So those colors have been added to the bottom of my color palette. So this is just to have some shades to work from, especially if I want to match colors that are already in the piece, like match the same darks or the same blues. But I will also be freely selecting colors from the whole grease pencil color palette as I see fit, without any limitations on that. And so for this part of the process, I'm planning on using exclusively the solid stroke material, which I have not used yet in this piece. And remember, this is basically the exact same kind of material as we've been using for the first strokes material. And so I will be using it for both adding very fine details with the brush size quite small. I can change the brush radius with the shortcut F. So to add small details like that, and I'll also be using it with a much larger radius size to glaze on colors to the piece as a whole. And so this slider, the radius slider, does max out at 500, but you can press on it and go all the way up to 5,000 for your brush size, which I find really helpful for this stage of like glazing on light colors at low opacity. So now that I've ruined what I have, I will just go into edit mode, lock my first radar layer, select all, and delete. All right, let's get started. So I started by glazing on big strokes of color, specifically adding blues to my piece, because I didn't want to just go for something darker, but I really wanted to infuse a magical element into this nighttime version and to make it unique from the day version. I also added a bit of muted purple to make the browns of the fur a bit cooler, in general, I'm cooling down the color palette of this whole version of the piece. So I used colors both from the colors that I had picked with the eyedropper and also just Grease Pencil's default color palette. And then I would right click to bring up this menu, which allowed me to modify these colors to get them more how I wanted them. And so as you can see in the top left-hand corner, I'm basing my colors by this quick 15-minute test piece that I did while I was planning this video. And so my intention now is to take these colors even further and to render the dark version more. But speaking of rendering, I kind of had to take a step back and slow my horses because I realized I was like rendering the dark version a lot more than the day version was rendered. And so, you know, I didn't want them to clash by having one be way more rendered than the other. I wanted them to have a similar level of finish. So very reluctantly, I started to think about stopping. And I also used my brush at a very small radius size to sketch in some stars and constellations. That is one of my personal favorite things to add for animals that have dark fur. Again, just a little bit of magic in this fantasy animal piece. And then the last thing I decided to add was a moon. Followed by a second moon. So this piece was actually inspired by Stephen King's new book, Fairy Tale. That's why I've named the dog layers Radar. And so without spoiling anything, 2 moons is relevant. That's all I'll say. So here is the final art piece. I am so happy with how it came out. And so now I want to animate this new layer to appear, to come in. And I can do that in the modifiers once again by adding a build modifier. So first, I'll open up the influence dropdown and have it influence only the radar dark layer. And then in the frame count, I'll test out having it go over 60 frames because that is already the length of the day to night animation. I might change that later on. And then so in the timeline, my frame was created because auto keying is turned on. It was created, this just happened to be the frame I was on when I started drawing on this new layer. So what I'll do is I can select this keyframe, move it with G, and we can see the effect of the build modifier happening as I move the keyframe back. But anyways, I'm gonna move it to frame 80, which once again, that's when the animation starts and the day to night shift starts. So definitely, I think it would make a lot more sense to have the strokes start to be drawn in later on in the animation, because they're starting here at frame 80, but with the first 20-30 frames of the animation, it doesn't even get that much darker. So I'm definitely gonna scooch that a bit already. I'll try out frame 110. So we're getting a bit darker, and then strokes start to appear. So the strokes are being drawn in based on the order in which I drew them. So I started with these kind of glazed on strokes on the back of the dog, and then I finished with these more background strokes to fill in the background to draw the moons. I made the background a bit more blue, and so I think it would make a lot more sense to start the animation with those strokes being drawn in and to finish with the strokes of the dog. So I can actually do that. I can change the order in which the strokes were drawn in, or the order in which Blender thinks the strokes were drawn in edit mode. So I'm using the lasso select tool up here. This selection mode here, because that's just the one I prefer. So now I can hold shift and drag kind of just around the dog without actually selecting the dog or anything inside the dog. And while I'm in this selection mode up here, selecting the strokes, I really just need to, select over a really small part of the stroke to select it as a whole. So now if I do G just to do some test movements, I can see that I've pretty much gotten all of the strokes that I wanted to get. And then what I can do with this selection, I can right click and then in arrange, if I send them to the back, it created a new keyframe because auto keying is still turned on. I don't use it much, so that caught me off guard, but that's okay. I'll just, with this keyframe selected, and move it back to 110. That's the only keyframe now. That's fine. It's not a big deal. So, but by sending those strokes to the back as I did. Now if I play back my animation, you can see that now those are the ones that get drawn in first. Grease pencil strokes, they're layered from bottom to top based on when you drew them. So the bottommost strokes are the ones that you drew first, and then the more strokes you draw, they get layered on top of previous strokes. And so the build modifier, it follows that timing of when the strokes were drawn in, but the timing is based on the bottom to top layering. And so that's a way that you can change which strokes get drawn in first using the arrange, sending them backwards, forwards, to the front or to the back to change their order and when the build modifier will draw them in. I do think where this is placed in the animation now makes a lot more sense. So I'm pretty happy with this. But while I'm in the modifiers tab and while I'm figuring out the animation, now that we have a bit of animation incorporated into the piece, I find that as a whole, the piece is starting to feel a bit too still and motionless. And so something that I really like to do to just add a bit of life, a bit of bounce and dance to a grease pencil drawing is to use the noise modifier. This is too much. Way too much, so I'll lower the position value like way low, something like between 0.02 to 0.05. And then something I noticed as I was doing my sketch is that I really like for the constellations in the fur of the dark version to kind of have like a flickering look, and so I was able to achieve that by upping the thickness. That's probably too much again, which creates a bit of a, I mean, it creates a flickering effect for all of the strokes, of course, but I think especially for those stars and constellations, it's pretty nice. It also gives a bit of dance and movement to the light version. So I think the next detail that I want to add are some surrounding details, mainly some little points of light, some little fireflies that will flicker on and off. So I will use a different grease pencil object for this new element that I'll be creating. So I will Shift A to add a grease pencil blank. So I'll just I created a new material slot and I'll use the drop down to add back in my solid stroke material. And then I'll go to about frame 160. I'll move the keyframe up to this point here. And then I just want to draw some quick dots with a yellow color, varying their opacity, their size, just by using the F to resize the radius and then varying how hard I press with my pen pad. And then for this new grease pencil object, what I'll do, rather than working with the modifiers this time around, I'll actually be working with the grease pencil effects. And so I will add in a glow effect. But in order to see the effects, we actually need to go into render view mode, which you can bring up this pie menu with a Z and it's up here, or you can also use this button here. So this made my reference image disappear. I'm not too sure what that was about, what happened there. That was unexpected. So the way that I fixed this in my planning of this video is by going into the drop down up here, and I changed the render pass to environment. That seemed to fix it. So now there is no change if we toggle material preview mode and render view mode, which is what I'm used to. So again, not sure what happened there, but all good. And then the glow, the way that I like to use the glow effect, I like to use the color mode. I'll change the color to be kind of like a golden yellow color to match the color of the stars that I have, the fireflies. Bring the threshold all the way up to 1. So we're already seeing a little bit of an effect, especially here in these dark areas. I do like to check the box for glow under. So I'll use the drop down to duplicate, and now I find I can actually notice it. And then I'll use these size sliders here, drag down to select both of them, and then I'll make this second glow effect have a smaller size. And so I can see the effect, turning it on and off by toggling material preview mode and render view mode. So it's a pretty subtle effect, but I think it's still nice nonetheless. And then I do also like to add a blur effect. Maybe make this smaller though, more subtle. So again, just a subtle thing. I really like the look of it. Okay, so now for the flickering lights animation. I've long been looking for a way to do a flickering lights animation in grease pencil, preferably an easy way. So I did this piece, and I think the effect is really nice, and I'm really happy with it, but it took so long to set up a bunch of keyframes, a bunch of different opacity modifiers to do it. I don't want to do that again. So here is the quicker method that I tried out just for this tutorial. Let's see how it goes. So I have this black and white image that is basically, well, it's these spots. They are fully opaque, and the rest of the image is fully transparent, and it's also extremely blurry. That is important. So I did this to one of my usual black and white textures. I have a whole video about how I make them, how I use them, and I basically just added a blur effect to one of these in Krita. So back to Blender. So in the Materials Properties tab, I will create a new material and double click to rename it Light Mask. Then I will remove the stroke, add a fill portion of it, give it a texture style, and then plug my image into this material. And then in the Object Data Properties, I'll create a new layer. I'll name this one Light Mask. And while I'm here, I'll also rename my original light layer to just Lights. So in this new layer, I will draw a stroke. I basically want to go just fill up the entire canvas, bigger than the canvas. And this is what it looks like. It already looks kind of like a starry sky in itself, albeit one that really obviously tiles and repeats. So it's a bit hard to explain what I'm doing here until you see it. So now back in the Materials Properties tab, I do want to raise the scale sliders of this material. So I can click on the X scale slider and drag down to select both of them. And I will drag it up to about roughly 2.5. And now basically what I want to do, back in my layers, I want to select the lights layer, turn on the option for masks here, open up the drop down and add the light mask as a mask. And then I can select my light mask layer and lower the opacity to 0. And three lights remain. So because of the mask that I just set up, if I go back into the Materials Properties tab and I move the location values of this texture material, what do we get? But lights flickering in and out. Not a lot of lights though, barely any. So I want to work on that first thing. Basically, I just want to add a lot more lights. Originally, how many I drew was roughly how many I wanted to be appearing at a time, but that is no longer enough. And also, I don't feel like drawing any more stars, any more lights, so let's do that with modifiers. So first, back in the layers, I will hide the light mask layer. If I just make it invisible, then all of the lights appear once again. And now I can go into the Modifiers Properties tab, and I want to add an array modifier. I will give it a count of 3. So essentially this will create two duplicates of every dot. And before I forget, I do want to open up the drop down for the influence here and have it influence only the lights layer. So for this, I had the best result personally when I checked off the box for relative offset and instead used the setting called constant offset. And then we can move our duplicates of the lights up and down, but actually what I find really cool is that I can essentially move them in 3D space using the Y slider. So, I mean, in general, I think this is very fun to look at. I love that already. And then I think I'll just slightly modify the X and the Z values. And then I also really liked the effect when I duplicated this array modifier and instead had this one going in the Y in the opposite direction, going outward. And maybe I'll change up once again, the X and the Y a little bit. So yeah, I think that's a really nice star-filled canvas that we have. Overall, I'm not noticing too much repetition. But I do feel like the like one big dot here, like this dot here, it's too big compared to the other dots, and it just, for that reason, it stands out too much. So I did just delete that in edit mode, select it and delete it. So now if I turn the light mask back on, we see almost nothing. But As I scroll through the location value sliders, in general, I'm pretty happy with the amount of stars that remain, but I will say I do think that it's not, the stars that show up aren't as opaque as they originally were, and I think that has to do with the opacity of the mask line that I created. So I can do an edit mode, select that line, Shift D to duplicate it, and right click to snap it back to its original position. And if I do that again, I think now the lights that show up are as bright as they were before. So I really like the clusters of lights that are appearing with this method. So what I could do to animate this movement is essentially to, keyframe the location for both the X and the Y values at the first frame that the lights appear. And then at the end of our animation, I can just move these values a little bit, keyframe those. And this is just something that I need to test out to see how it looks, to see how the speed looks, how the animation looks, if I like it. I think that for something that took me 5 minutes to set up, I think it looks pretty nice, and so I'm just gonna go with that. But one thing that I do want to do in the dope sheet, so I want to select the 2 keyframes for the location of the light mask material, that is these here, and right click and change the interpolation mode to linear, just so this makes the speed of the material movement and the flickering constant. So I mean, it's gonna look different when I render because the frame count is pretty low because my poor laptop. So next thing is I do want to animate these lights to appear because basically they just suddenly pop up from one frame to the other currently. And so once again, in the dope sheet timeline, I can just select these 2 keyframes, which are the 2 layer keyframes, and with G, when does my animation start getting dark? So I think around 1:10 it would make sense for them to start slowly appearing. So I'll select these keyframes, and I'll also select the materials movement keyframes and move them all back with G to frame 1:10. Here the stars appear. Again, it's really sudden. It's from one frame to the next. And so I can have them slowly fade in using, once again, a modifier, and I will add a opacity modifier. And here at frame 1:10, I will change it to 0 and keyframe that. And then by frame 140, I would already like them to be fully appeared, so I can change the opacity to 1, and that is keyframed. So we can see they slowly start to appear. Okay, so the final thing that we have left to do is to reverse the animation to set it up so that it loops. I was starting to think that the start of the animation is too long, so I'll probably bump the start of the animation up 50 frames here in the output properties, change the frame start to 50, and I will have it go all the way to frame 300, because basically from frame 250 to frame 300, I wanted to reverse the animation. First, I will look at the radar grease pencil object that we have. So first up, we had the hue saturation value modifier, and so here at frame 250, I will keyframe all of these values, and then at frame 300, I'll return all of these values to their default values, which is 0.5 for the hue and 1 for both the saturation and value sliders. We get something horrifying that comes up. And we still have the night strokes of the dog that are appearing. And so we had the build modifier draw them in originally, and we can actually draw them out with the exact same modifier. So add another build modifier, have it affect just the radar dark layer, and this time we're going to change the transition to shrink, which made the strokes draw out. And so the radar dark layer is here. So it first appeared at frame 110. And so if we want the shrink to start at frame 250, and 250 is 140 frames after 110, so in the modifier, we can set the start delay to 140 so that at frame 250, the dark strokes, the dark lines still appear, they still show up. And then I'll change the frame count to 50 so that the draw out animation will happen all in all over the 50 frames from 250 to 300. And then we can do the exact same thing for the opacity modifier of our lights. So here at frame 250, keyframe the opacity factor at 1. At frame 300, bring it down to 0, and that has been keyframed as well. So, you know, the paper texture no longer matches, and we get a nightmare. But I mentioned earlier that we would return to the compositing nodes for the final animation. So here in our World Properties tab, I want to uncheck this box for use nodes and go back to our compositing workspace. I can select our RGB curves node. At frame 250, I want to right click over the FAC value and insert a keyframe. And then at frame 300, bring it down to 0, and that created a keyframe as well. And that is pretty much all that we needed to do. So I am going to do a test render at 50%, just to see if I like it before I do my final render at 100%, because that will take a while. So it's Control F12 to render. We already set up all of the file format and everything, so now we wait. Okay, so some final things that I'm noting. For one, I do feel like the noise modifier for the dog could definitely have more of an impact. And so back in my 2D animation workspace, I will change the effect of the modifier, the noise modifier, to position to be about 0.6. And then I definitely think the speed of the flickering lights is way too intense. So I'm just gonna select my lights layer, my lights object, grab those keyframes. Those are these keyframes here. And I'll move them back forward here, just to the start of the timeline. I mean, the lights don't even appear there yet, so that's not going to change anything, but it will make the animation slower. And then I'll also nudge these ones forward a bit as well, because I did realize that I forgot to move it forward so that the flickering lights kind of stopped at the end there while the lights were still fading out. So that should be good. I'm gonna do a final render now, let you know of any final changes that I made, but we're pretty much done. Okay, finally, last little change. So I thought that this area of lights was too much, especially like it kind of punches you in the face as soon as the night portion appears. So I wanted to reduce that. So I went into edit mode, I hid the mask, I hid the array modifier, and I basically just deleted 2 points for a much more subtle look. And so that is it for this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. I forgot how much work it took to do big tutorials like this. Thank you for sticking around. I really appreciate it. Please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel. That helps out a lot. There's lots of other ways to support me linked below. I'm tired. And you can find me all over the internet at Sophie Jantak. I hope you're doing well. Take care. Bye.